Hello.
Hello, Edie. How are you?
I'm good. How about you, Michael?
Well, you know what? Um, it's nice to be wanted by everybody but the police. How's that sound?
I love it when you say that. That's such a good one.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Michael. How are you? How is everyone today?
We are all doing well. Obviously, end of the year, everybody's got a little bit too much work to get done before the holidays, but I am so pleased that we were able to put this together. And I see Elizabeth up there. Um, and so aware that we are continuing on specifically with uh, the Clinical Trials Clubhouse, and from the standpoint of a Consuli conversation standpoint, I think this is so pertinent because of the impacts of potential fraud or misconduct complications in terms of overall trust in clinical trial, um, operationalizing and really looking at what these impacts have on people's desire to stay enrolled or get enrolled. I think this is a really, really good topic. And Sophie, I think between Edie and you and myself, we've surfaced enough really pertinent examples, both past and contemporary, that is going to make this a good conversation. So I'm really pleased to see all the people who are already in our audience here. And we're going a little bit free form today because of the nature of this discussion. I think Edie, as we're able to get people up onto the dais here, we can incorporate them. But I think one of the key things that we want to do is specifically outline what part of misconduct, et cetera, are we going to actually try to attack.
Yeah, and if you're ready, I'm absolutely happy to start talking, or we can give it another minute or two, see if a
Yeah,
couple more
let me
folks
give it.
trickle in.
Yeah, let's keep chatting for a minute here because I realized I need to make a couple of you into moderators.
So while you're doing that, Michael, let me go through a little bit of housekeeping for anyone who might be new or,
Perfect.
hasn't kept track of the changes with Clubhouse. Um, and just our room etiquette, the way we run this discussion usually for the past year or so, we've been doing this, is, we have a number of panelists who have a vested interest in each discussion topic, and we briefly introduce ourselves, and then we introduce our opinion or our take on the topic, and we proceed from left to right and top down. And if any of the panelists want to chime in on a topic or a question or a response, um, they can slow tap their mic. That indicates that you have something to add or something to ask. If you are applauding or if you want to agree with a speaker, you can fast tap your mic like Scott and Michael are doing there. We also have now the emojis. So if you touch and hold your profile, like Edie just did, you get a variety of emotions that you can use to agree or disagree or provide your response to anything anyone is saying. And if you're in the audience and you would like to come up and speak, add to the topic, um, you can raise your hand. There's a hand raising feature at the bottom, and we can bring you up to the stage to speak. We just ask that if you do want to be brought up to the stage, to please make sure your profile is filled out with your photo, your name, and something in your profile that lets us know why this topic is relevant for you, where your interest lies, so that we can bring you up and we can stay in keeping with the topic at hand today. All right. So with that, I think we're going to start bringing people up. And Edie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because those of us who have lived in research fraud and research misconduct. And I don't mean protocol deviations, and I don't mean the non-compliance you report to the IRB, which we are often talking about when we're at the site level or the sponsor level, right, or working in QA. This is a different kind of problem. This is a different type of integrity and issue. And it's unfortunately not new, and it has so much to do with trust and patience, and it focuses on some very key communities over time. And some of it are going to be some historical pieces that you've heard of before, right? We all reference the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, often referred to as Tuskegee, right, as a kind of hallmark issue of why we have certain communities that would have, for good reason, lack of faith in innovative care, in research. But this is a different type of scope. And so you have to think of it as two buckets, right? One very large one and then a slightly smaller one within that larger one. The overall large bucket is what we call professionally, or in the legalese speak, if you will, the compliance speak, responsible conduct of research. So I'm going to talk about briefly here what kind of activities in a minute that looks like beyond what the smaller bucket is, okay? And that smaller bucket we call FFP. It is the falsification, the fabrication, or the plagiarism of research. And it's truly the heart of what we call research misconduct in the compliance industry. It's very difficult to prevent, actually. It's actually even harder to detect, especially as we spend more and more time with technology and research. And it seems pretty obvious, right? This is not something that categorically you find a lot of disagreement with in the research community, that you shouldn't falsify your data, you shouldn't fabricate it, and you shouldn't plagiarize it when you're writing it up. However, we continue to see throughout, frankly, the history, as far back as we've been tracking it anyway, that the notion that the research community could self-police and acknowledge and keep this under control is unfortunately wrong. Right? And so when we start to look, at least in the United States, back into the 1970s and 80s, you have some, frankly, some very confusing conversations happening, because in addition to evidence being difficult to collect, not having regulations around how you investigate and what the standards are, and the community itself saying, hey, we self-police, we self-regulate, you stay out of our science, you really didn't have rules. So it wasn't as if there was anything for anyone to enforce. So that was also very problematic. And it really started to begin to show doubt on the efficacy of peer review within research, because some of the hallmark cases, and I certainly won't list them all, but one of my personal favorites is in the mid-70s, you have William Summerlin, who's doing some preclinical data on mice, and he wants to show that he's able to have a transfer of genes that shows up in typing on the actual fur and skin of the mouse. And when it didn't work, he used a black marker, like a Sharpie, to make black spots on the white mice so that it looked like it had occurred, knowing that no one was going to, rub the spots on the mice to see that they were just Sharpied white mice, right? So this is one of our earliest documented cases. So as far-fetched as it sounds, this is real, and this is happening. And I can list a whole bunch more cases just in the 70s and 80s. One of our most famous cases you get asked about is actually at that time, it was discovered, unfortunately, that Martin Luther King's PhD dissertation research was plagiarized. And this created a very large kerfuffle within the ethics community of what to do then with the fact that it's not just those individuals we categorize as bad actors who may have performed bad, instances of misconduct, right? So when we think about recent cases, and again, I'm still in the small bucket, I'm still thinking just FFP, and then I'll give you some examples outside in that bigger bucket of responsible conduct of research. But a couple of recent cases that I think are really important and that really highlight the breadth of regulatory schema. And if you don't know anything about this, and this really is interesting to you, check out the Office of Research Integrity. It's a federal office under DHHS. It will give you everything you need to know and more about, frankly, all the federal policies, as well as it literally posts every federal guilty finding. So this is a matter of public record if you do this with federal dollars. Even when you don't, you're still violating policy. So we have a case back in 2015 that was pretty infamous, some of you might have seen, where an HIV researcher was found guilty of misconduct. He had taken significant millions of dollars in NIH funding and had completely fabricated that he was having good results on his way to an HIV vaccine. And he is, I believe, set to be released here shortly from federal prison. So he not only had ramifications from the federal government and will never do research on federal dollars or in the United States again, but he actually was sentenced. So it can go as far as prison. Another really infamous one that I think is highly important in today's day and age, and if you didn't already know this, I hope you'll tell everyone you know and your family and friends about this. But back in 2011, there was a series of articles that was published in the BMJ, and they were out of a London medical school by a researcher named Andrew Wakefield. And he claimed that he could show that the MMR vaccine and autism were linked. And this started a fire. Pardon my French, a shitstorm of a public health situation, because several members of the U.S. Hollywood elite, if you will, picked this up and ran with it. And it was not discredited until several years later, right? And it initially was discredited as just bad science until it was further determined this was true bad actor misconduct. It was completely fraudulent. And we can now see the long-term downstream impact that's had on parents' willingness, particularly in the United States, but also globally, to pursue regular vaccination within our children. I would argue it's also had a heavy impact on things like the recently developed COVID vaccination and the boosters. And that obviously is a big part of our industry. Last but not least, here recently, some of you might have seen that Duke actually settled a research misconduct case and had to pay the government well into the hundreds of millions, right? Because it was claimed that they knew earlier than they were able to stop the misconduct that was occurring, and that they hadn't appropriately qualified and trained certain individuals on a research team. So it's certainly not limited to small schools we haven't heard about or don't have respect for. It's certainly not limited to the United States. And it has, again, some pretty serious downstream impact. But it also comes because, you know, you publish or perish, right? In our industry, you're always looking for funding. You better succeed in the lab, right? Now we're using technology, even harder to catch. And then you have this bigger bucket outside of just FFP. And that's what some of the cases Sophie's going to talk about get into. And these are, what do you do with all the other questionable research practices or research culture that we find that doesn't fall squarely within a falsification or a fabrication or a plagiarism? And the reason I care about that is because from a legal and regulatory perspective, we have to remember the laws in the United States, the federal laws about this, stop at FFP. So this bigger bucket is more about how you conduct your culture, what does your organization say, and how are you going to prevent, detect, and deal with these? So what about authorship? What about lacking management? What about issues, we hear about horrific issues in the lab where someone who's on an immigrant visa as a student is threatened if they don't respond to or provide certain results, right? So there's several examples, and I want to park it there so that Sophie can pick it up, as well as Michael, and talk through some of these cases we're starting to see, because you're starting to see some of these issues that are in that bigger bucket that aren't squarely regulated lead to things like fraud. And so we need to start coming up with a better way to prevent and detect. This is Edie. I'm complete.
Edie, great opening, because you've helped characterize the landscape of what we really want to try and drill down to today. This could be a topic that certainly expands and spills over into next month as well. But two items I want to follow up on. Number one is, first and foremost, to make sure that we acknowledge that Scott Schleibner has joined us as another co-moderator. And Scott, I'll ask you to chime in here in a moment. But the other thing is, Edie, please don't overestimate the mnemonic understanding that the group might have. So when you start using some of these terms like FFP, please feel free to define.
Oh yeah, agreed. And if that wasn't clear, sorry, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. I was trying to go fast because I don't want to inundate everyone. Not everyone gets as excited and nerded out about this as I do. But if you guys have questions, just back channel me, and I'm more than happy to explain anything. Or if you want like more examples of the questionable research practices that don't fall right in that neat little bucket that's regulated, and like what do we do about it and what do we see organizations doing about it, I'm happy to chat about that because I help navigate it all the time. But I just wanted to make sure Sophie had enough time to give examples of
those absolutely.
Cases for today. So yeah, back channel me if anyone has questions. Happy to help.
Okay. All righty, Sophie?
Edie, so before I launch into our recent cases, I wanted to actually give you a chance to introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know you in our audience, because there's a reason why you know so much about the history.
Because I'm a huge nerd. No, so for you guys who don't maybe know me, I'm Edie Edens. So I am a licensed attorney and professional research ethicist who is based in Indianapolis and works for primarily First Class Solutions in research compliance consulting. We're based out of the U.S., like I said, but do work. My scope and my subject matter expertise extends internationally. And this is actually, research misconduct is not only something I focused exclusively on when I was in-house at a very large academic medical center, hint, hint, it was in Indianapolis, for several years in my career, building this out. And really exploring this like subculture, even you didn't know about this research compliance community, even though I'd been in it for years, kind of group in the misconduct space and the research integrity space, because there's some very, very powerful, amazing folks trying to, really make change there. But then I've also had the chance to, go out and educate on this topic and work with clients individually on this topic in my consulting career and be a part of some of the large national conferences that talk about it and do my master's research on it. So it's just a really particularly interesting topic to me and part of why I love really sharing it. And I think it's important that if we're on such a great path right now of educating everyone about clinical trials and making them aware, so they need to be aware about this part too, right? It might not be the sexiest part or the funnest part to talk about, but it's still really important. So thank you. This is Edie.
Thanks so much, Edie. That's exactly what I wanted to start off the room. So yeah, we just thought that this was a really important topic, especially in the face of the mistrust that we are seeing, even especially post-pandemic, with everything that's going on, and our understanding or lack of understanding of how investigational products, medicines, and devices are tested and put through the multiple phases of clinical trials and attain FDA approval or outside of US approval and are then put on the market. And the way that this kind of fraud or falsification affects that trust, affects those relationships. So with that, I just wanted to talk about some recent examples. For those who don't know me, my name is Sophie Johannan. I'm a clinical scientist at a medical device company called Galvanize Therapeutics. And before this, I was at a larger device company called Boston Scientific. And I've been working in clinical trials across multiple therapeutic areas and multiple roles for the past 19 years. But definitely, this is one of my most, I don't want to say favorite because it's not a good thing, but something I'm passionate about is ethical clinical trials and clean data. Are we really acquiring the right kind of data to approve the drugs and devices that we're testing? And are we doing a service to the patients who are volunteering their time to these studies? So I want to talk about an article that came out in October 13th. U.S. Department of Justice press release talked about a Miami study site where the defendants enrolled subjects in a clinical trial, even though those subjects failed to meet eligibility criteria, falsified subject laboratory results, falsified medical records, and falsely represented that subjects were taking the drug being studied when in fact they were not. So pretty much all of the data that was collected on those patients for that clinical trial was garbage. I just can't believe, after all of the history that Edie gave us, all of the rules and regulations and guidelines that we have in place in the US and even internationally, that this can still happen. So I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to examine, first of all, why this is happening, and Edie touched on that a little bit. Publish or perish, right? I think there is a certain amount of pressure to enroll patients in a significant sample size in clinical trials, And, some sites and some sponsors consider this it's revenue, right? So the number of patients enrolled is directly linked to revenue. So that's part of it. While I'm glad that these examples are being unearthed and, we are able to talk about it, I want to go a little bit further. What can we do to prevent these kinds of incidents in the future? How can we sort of improve these relationships between sites, sponsors, and CROs and our regulators to make sure that this doesn't happen? And so another example I wanted to talk about was also on October 13th, when a writer interviewed multiple statisticians asking about, their experience about making decisions during statistical analysis. This was really disturbing because there were multiple statisticians who came forward and said that they were asked to do dubious things, ethically dubious things, like altering data records, falsifying statistical significance, and stressing only the significant findings. This was published this week in the Annals of Internal Medicine. That was the week of October 13th. So it's not just happening at the site level, it's happening at the sponsor level, at the CRO level. And the last example I wanted to bring forward was a site in Florida. Two CRO study coordinators who pled guilty to falsifying clinical trial data. This was identified by the DOJ, and they worked with big name pharma companies like Pfizer, Gilead, Takeda, Boehringer Ingelheim, Eli Lilly, to name a few, for really important trials like opioid dependency, irritable bowel syndrome, and diabetes. And again, they were falsifying data, enrolling patients who were not really eligible, and falsifying their medical records to make them appear eligible, and falsifying their lab results as well. So this was on October 19th, so as recent as October 19th of this year. So these are the examples that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to get some of our panelists' opinions on maybe why this is still happening so recently. What have they seen anything similar to this? What kinds of safeguards can we put into place at our sites and our sponsors and our CROs to prevent this from happening? Is there some kind of incentive for clinical research professionals to commit fraud, even knowing what the consequences are, and how can we remove those incentives? So with that, I will pass the mic back to Michael, and I'm sure we're going to hear from Scott and Pamela shortly thereafter.
Sophie, excellent. I think you've given a really contemporary, current scenario, which are a number of scenarios here, which underscore the fact that this is, even with all of the discussions that go on about ethics and compliance and trying to make sure that the clinical trials really represent what needs to be studied, that still this level of fraud goes on. And it is a very complex, as Edie alluded to, it's a very complex milieu of circumstances which cause this, not the least of which is the financial, especially at the site level, the financial impacts of not accruing the target number of patients. I am aware, I can't give you the specific site, the citation, but I am aware of a site which was eventually indicted because the actual clinical, the conductors of the clinical trial actually entered themselves in the clinical trial under aliases and then got the site paid for their engagement. and then they falsified the data that because they didn't actually perform all the experiments. So there are hundreds of bad examples that we can put forth here, but taking a look at what are the drivers here is probably an area where we need to spend a little bit more time. And I'd like to offer to Scott a chance to weigh in, because he's had a vast amount of exposure at the ClinOps level, as well as understanding strategically what drives this. So Scott, if you don't mind, can we have you weigh in for a few minutes?
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And thanks, Edie and Sophie, for teeing up, sort of opening up this topic, really, which is critical. And, even for somebody like me who's been in the industry for like 27 years now, it still is a little mind-blowing and a little bit depressing to even realize these things still are happening. Granted, I think it's a very small fraction of people that are intentionally bad actors, but as you're pointing out, the impact is so disproportionately large and damaging, right? Whether it's trust around vaccines, whether it's trust around clinical trials that most people still don't understand, one or two bad actors, one or two sort of, news reports like this can set our industry back, a decade in terms of trust. This all is happening, of course, in the context of most people don't really understand clinical trial, clinical development. Most people, right, less than 5% of people who are eligible actually participate in clinical trials. We all struggle trying to explain our industry and what we do, and to try to educate patients and try to build trust. We've covered this a lot the last couple months as we've talked about justice and equity and diversity and inclusion. A news report like this comes out, factually, sort of, describing what sounds like a bad movie, actually. And that ability to build trust is just set back dramatically. So the damage is incredible. I get concerned as somebody who's been kind of very oriented towards the patients themselves and try to be patient focused before it was cool. I grow more concerned that as we move into some what we're calling decentralized clinical trials, right? I think the D will probably drop and it'll just be the new model. But as we move to these new paradigms where we actually move away from clinical centers, we use technology, we move to patients' homes, we're sort of introducing another whole host of variables of, in some regards, kind of lack of oversight, maybe. Maybe we're losing even a couple of the pieces that used to help kind of put some guardrails in place for these kinds of things. I find that in my world, we're very good up front with protocol review and ethics committees and IRBs, making sure subjects' rights are protected and that there's some safety measures in place, maybe data monitoring committees or data safety monitoring boards. But there's still, I think, kind of a big gap there around, assuming trust, assuming best intentions, and even if it's 99.9% of the time it's good, that 0.1% is unbelievably damaging, right? We know we're in an industry that is often viewed negatively by the general public. We happen to have a fairly positive rating right now, and thanks to a lot of our amazing innovative work around COVID vaccines, that's great. But somebody who loves this space, it hurts me that we have a couple bad actors that do a lot of damage. So really, I don't have solutions. I think we've got some panelists here that know a lot about this topic. I'm just interested in maybe working towards some, potential brainstorming of ideas of how do we ensure there's proper oversight if things do move more away from sites to more virtual, decentralized approaches. How do we safeguard against that? How do we make sure we build trust and not lose trust with patients? So that's what I'm thinking about. My name is Scott, and I will pause it there.
Scott, thanks you so much. As you were talking here, obviously, while I think the COVID vaccine development scenario is a major triumph in showing how, effective protocols and effective management can actually result in things that are positive for the patient population. But we also recognize that as we've dug into things over the last 4 months with the JEDI discussion, those of you who have joined us before, understanding that even within the context of trying to do good clinical trials, we didn't do a great job in representing all the populations who were, in some cases, disproportionately affected by COVID. So in an effort to reach out to them, there's this discovery that a lot of their lack of participation is because of this lack of trust, and because of this disinformation or misinformation that goes on around, anything as wild as chips being imported into the vaccine trials so that people can be tracked. And it's not helped when social media is not supporting the ethical piece of this, but instead going for the sensational pieces of it. So I agree with you that there's a lot that can still be done, and maybe social media is a place where a counter information campaign can be mounted, just as a thought.
Yeah. Well,
So
just to add one thing to that, Michael, real
sure.
quick. I realize Christine's here and Pamela hasn't had a chance to talk as well. But, as Sophie was talking about, what these incentives, right? Like what's the mindset here in, let's say it's investigative site staff or a community center or whatever, to sort of intentionally sort of be fraudulent, right? I mean, there's certainly a financial incentive. But one of the things that concerns me, to kind of tie this back to sort of the JEDI and diversity topic a little bit, is I don't know how much exposure the panel has to this, but I'm around this day to day where we now have clinical trials and biotech clients that are saying, we really want to make sure that the enrollment in this study is representative of the overall population, right? We have people thinking the right way, saying, let's do good science and let's make sure we're putting this out there broadly and providing access to anybody who might want it. Let's try to reach, maybe some underserved populations. So there's this new movement to do this, and built into this, what makes me a little nervous is there are percent of your patients African American patients. It's hard to do. It's hard to find the right kinds of patients. This all goes back to trust. But now we have individual sites sort of financially incentivized even further beyond just enrollment to actually enroll a certain kind of person who looks a certain way or comes from a certain background. And, if you extend that kind of fraudulent mindset there to financial incentives, I can see a lot of harm being done by people out there, maybe driven to enroll a diverse population. But, the potential for fraud there is huge as well. And that would be really, really damaging. In an effort to do the right thing, we would actually take huge steps backwards. So I wanted to kind of bring that part out there because I feel like that's a new development maybe over the last 24 months.
Very good. I think that was definitely worth adding to the discussion here. Pamela, you've been patiently waiting in the wings here. How about if we get you to weigh in on a couple ideas?
Hey, Michael, before Pamela starts, can you recap for me? I'm a little late.
Sure, that's okay. Actually, so I'm not talking too much. Sophie, do you want to just give her a quick encapsulation?
Sure. Hi, Christine. Nice to have you. Yeah, we're talking about fraud, falsification in clinical trials because this has come up recently. So you can see I pinned a link to the top of the room of a recent incident that happened in Florida where site personnel, clinical research coordinators, leads, staff were falsifying patient data, falsifying records, medical records, and enrolling patients who weren't actually eligible in the trial by making it appear that they were eligible by altering their data, and also using false lab samples to provide lab values that were within range according to the clinical trial protocol. So this is kind of extreme version of fraud to me, that I was surprised to find 3 such articles so very recently, within the past month or two, that happened. And so I asked Edie to actually talk about the 30, 40-year history of this type of fraud. And so she gave us a really eloquent recap of the history of fraud in clinical trials. It goes all the way back, much further than that, to the reasons why we have ethics in clinical research, the reasons why we have safeguards in place to protect patient data, protected patient information, and why we have subject numbers for patients, and we have consent forms that are, all encompassing for patients to describe their rights and benefits and risks and all those kinds of things. And after having all of that and having our rules and regulations updated time and time again, to the point where we have such detailed guidance on how to design and carry out ethical research, we're still having this kind of fraud. It just jarred me, and I figured we needed to have a conversation about this. So I have 2 more examples to pin to the top of the page that I discussed just before you came in. One is another site where they were using fraudulent data, and the other one is a case, is actually a study, a survey conducted by a writer across multiple statisticians, who claim that it's very commonplace to be asked to falsify data, or not falsify data, but the way that the study results are statistically presented is not exactly accurate, and they're being asked to skew the results to provide a positive image of the drug or device performance. That's also very disturbing. So these are the things that we're talking about. Why is this happening in this day and age still? What is the incentive? And then ultimately, what safeguards can we put into place to prevent it? How can we take steps to try to fix this? So that's where we're going with it. And next is Pamela. She knows a lot about this, actually. So I'd love to hear from her, and then Christine, and then Dr. Heather.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, I'm Pamela. I work for an organization called Hartford Healthcare in Connecticut. I wear a couple of hats. So I've talked with some of you before. I'm a rare disease patient that's been heavily involved with patient advocacy. I've lobbied and worked with different patient advocacy organizations, and still do continuously. But professionally, I am a research auditor. And last week or 2 weeks ago, I spoke with AHARP, the Association of, I just closed it. Why did I do that? Association of the
for
Accreditation of Human Research Protections Programs. And it was about non-compliance in research. So I developed a tool for tracking non-compliance across systems that I've recently been sharing with different hospital systems so they can track their own non-compliance. Now, non-compliance is a little bit different than research misconduct, but it's the precursor. So non-compliance is defined as a failure to comply with the regulations, institutional policies, laws, or requirements or determinations of the IRB. So why is it important to track this? Because this gets at those incentives and the concerns that, why do people do these things? What's the root cause of it? And if you can start seeing where the trends are taking place, then my job hopefully is to get ahead of it with proper education, training, and oversight. Now, I really share Scott's concern with moving to decentralized trials because there is a greater lack of oversight. And I'm trending data from 2022 and comparing it to data from 2021. And I can see, and also I have data from 2017 to now. I see a trend emerging that sites that are operating not within the system, more of the expedited approved trials with less oversight, studies that can be done in a decentralized fashion that have less oversight, that's where I'm seeing my spikes in non-compliance. Again, I want to remind you, non-compliance doesn't necessarily fall under research misconduct, but it can certainly lead to it. So
Pamela, can I ask you really quick? Sorry to interrupt you. This is Edie. I'm super curious. Your non-compliance data, what kind of spikes are we talking about from, say, 17 to 21, 22? Oh, and here's the reason I asked, not because I don't believe you at all. I just know even when we were all married to the idea of on-site research only, we all had these high, we've had the caseloads of misconduct going up each year now for about 12 years.
Yeah.
So if the virtual nature changes it, I'm really curious because even before virtual, right, we were still having so many cases.
Correct.
So that's where I was trying to isolate, if you could give us anything on the exact trends or how much.
I haven't analyzed it yet, but what I have seen, I can pull up my report in a bit from last year. I haven't analyzed it yet, so I can't give you the most current, but what I've been doing is just recently, I'm going to pull the report next month because I do it by the year and to the next year. Sorry, I'm trying to pull it up and talk at the same time. I'm not as good at multitasking as Sophie is, but
I'm not good at it either. I'm just really good at faking it.
I'm like, I'm pulling it up. All right, let me get this thing here open so I can read some numbers to Edie here. Okay. And the thing that really surprised me was the trend with the common rule changes. I thought there would be more non-compliance in full board studies because less things were going to the IRB for expedited because it could be reviewed under exempt review. And I know not all of you guys live in IRB land like I do, but there were major regulatory changes that happened in right before 2019 to the common rule. That's what all research has to follow. It was actually implemented January 20th, 2020. And I expected a decrease in non-compliance for expedited, but what I found was the opposite. So I'm going to read you some numbers. Expedited non-compliance increased at my institution from in 2019, it was 47%. In 2020, 55%, and in 2021, 65%. And I'm already seeing it increasing in 2022, but I haven't calculated it all out. And then the full board noncompliance actually went down. Let me see if I can find the numbers. Eek. But what I discovered is that expedited noncompliance was attached to studies that used electronic systems. The majority of it was using RedCap for electronic data capture. And this year I just started looking at the data and I'm seeing more of it coming from areas that the coordinators and investigators are trying to conduct the study basically from their homes, like they're working remotely. And I think in terms of cause of why this is happening is lack of oversight. And so there aren't that hub of a research group with the manager there and your team workers, everybody there, and people are trying to work at home with their kids and their dog and their distractions, which sometimes works great for some people. But why are we seeing these studies increasing in noncompliance? Do I have all the answers right now? No, I'm just just telling you I'm seeing some trends from 2019 to now that it's increasing, and it's increasing
Sounds
with
like
those
a
studies from home.
potential lack of checks and balances, right? When you have a
Yep,
team on site, like you're describing, a coordinator, a data manager, a team lead, in addition to the investigator or sub-investigator, you end up having somebody or the other will catch, um, of non-compliance or missing data or unreported events. Whereas if everyone is remote, the chance that these people are checking and balancing each other is lower, maybe.
it's true. It's true. And we see it too in IRB land. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. It's the ethical committee that reviews all research. And we get calls all the time from various coordinators asking questions they shouldn't be asking us, questions that they should be asking a manager. Why aren't they asking their manager? Because they're all working from home. And so it's a lack of oversight, or they know their manager's busy. They don't want to bother their manager. They don't want to look foolish in front of their manager. And we're easy to find because we're all in the office. So I definitely see this concerning trend, and I share Scott's concern with move to decentralized trials. Although from a patient perspective, I love it. As a rare disease patient who has difficulty getting to research sites to participate in research, I love the idea of having the studies come to me or being able to do them from home. That sounds absolutely fantastic. But I see it opening a big Pandora's box also of potential noncompliance. So what guardrails do we put up? And that's where I've been like touting mentorship, team meetings like regularly, at least once a week with the main PI, more
Oh, you just said a
sponsor.
magical word, Pamela. I just have to.
The PI
Mentorship. It's
mentorship.
all about having, well, we talked about checks and balances already, but also having that support group of people who've gone through this before, who've
Right.
experienced this, know the loopholes, the pitfalls, and can catch you before you or on your way to your fall, right?
Exactly. And so that gets to yeah, it's that oversight. And how there was another piece that you mentioned, Sophie, was like the incentives to commit fraud. So I'm jumping topics a little bit because non-compliance tracking is what I do. Auditing is what I do. And I can't talk about my own institution's issues, but I can talk about like kind of my opinions on why people have incentives. And I do see, I would say, lack of oversight and too much trust in the other players on your team is where I see the biggest pitfalls. Sometimes investigators will bring in an outside investigator who's their buddy from a long time ago into the institution to come do some research, and they assume that their buddy is going to do everything on the up and up. And then their buddy collects the data, does the research, not on the up and up, and then leaves their friend kind of in the lurch. And the friend doesn't have any oversight. The friend just assumes like you're going to come in and do everything properly. I just trust you. So I don't need to pay attention to what you're doing. And I think that's like an unfortunate mindset to have. The other thing are investigators that are absentee. So investigators that are not communicating with their study teams regularly, don't know what's going on. Trust these coordinators. And the coordinators being hired, they're wonderful. They're working hard. They're either super worked and like killed with all the work, or they're like brand newbies with very little oversight and training. And though they need a lot of, those newbies need a lot of supervision and assistance and mentorship. And if they don't get it and they get pressure from the investigator, enroll, that's where I start to see like bad things happening. and the investigator puts their hands up, well, like, oh my gosh, I didn't know he or she was doing this. I didn't know. Nobody communicated with me. But it's essentially, it's their responsibility to have oversight of their trial. And so training of the investigators on their own responsibilities, I think is really important. The next piece Sophie mentioned was like the sponsor's role. And I've talked with Sophie about like different like crazy stories that I run into. I think there's like a lot of not coordinators. I've run into some monitors who are like working more than one job, maybe at the same time, or like doing some weird stuff. And so I think sponsors also need to have oversight of their own staff. If they're coming out to review records, are they really coming? Are they really looking at those records? Um, is the guidance and supervision provided by the sponsor adequate and appropriate? Is it appropriate to have a clinical study that only gets monitored like once every 3 years? So I think sponsors have a role to play in adding those guardrails to prevent non-compliance, which then leads to research misconduct. I can go on and on, but I see there's like more people popping in, so I'll let them talk.
Pamela, that was real world. Really appreciate those insights. What's really interestingly coming to the fore here is the amount of oversight that's actually required in order to assure, the compliance and that the people are walking the walk and talking the talk. So it's, I don't know, we can't continue to expand that because ultimately there just won't be enough people, and it just, will decelerate the rate at which we can get these trials done with everybody doing this oversight. And obviously, from an SIV standpoint, I just don't see the costs being able to be maintained in all of this. But I'm sure others have some views here. And Dr. Heather, you are new to this team here. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and then please weigh in. Dr. Heather? Okay. Christine, did you have something that you wanted to add? I saw you flashing your mic.
Actually, I was going to say, can Taya go first? I have to go do something really
Okay,
quick,
cool.
but I'm listening.
Well, Taya, I know you're trying to multitask here, but if you had something you wanted to add, please do.
Sure. So I've been listening, and I just wanted to jump in really quick. The the complexity of this issue is extreme, and I think the article that Sophie had shared was so shocking because it is criminal. Correct? There's like criminal actors, and then there's just people that drop the ball. And when you are someone that drops the ball, I wouldn't say it's necessarily oversight, because I've seen in the industry where they put extreme consequences on actions. So you will get fired if you do XYZ. And that just actually increases the chance of that happening, because people get so nervous that they end up making mistakes inevitably because they're thinking about not making the mistake. We have so many checks and balances, and how things do get through the cracks, I think, is more of an apathy that I see in my coworkers. And it's a burnout issue. Everyone's working so crazy. This entire week, I've literally had 4 hours of sleep each night because I have so many deadlines by end of year. So I can see it in my coworkers that they're just trying to get through the immense volume of work we have. And I think that's a completely different issue than criminal action, right? Which is what the Florida site is doing. They're acting in a way to mislead the sponsor so that they're getting paid for people that they're, falsifying their documents or lying. I've even seen articles where they make up patients, it's to pretend that they had screenings because they get paid so much per screening. So those are criminal acts and they should be handled, criminally and through the justice system. But for everyday employees, I think the majority of us are just suffering from, when you care so much about the industry and you care so much about patients, and then to see these things happen, and it's frustrating to deal with other workers that aren't as passionate as you and that should not be in the industry. But we need people, we need headcount. And another thing that we're facing is this high turnover in our industry. People leave every year for another job, and they're taking with them all the knowledge that they had, which would be limited after 1 year. But we don't have those, lifers at the company. Rarely you run into someone that has more than 5 years of experience at a particular company. So that in itself is an issue because we don't have the expertise needed for some of these things to, to be worked out through process. And that's what we're facing now is process that just doesn't function. And how are we going to correct that? But I agree with you, Michael. I don't think it's oversight that would help that. But I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I know you're working away there, and I appreciate those insights because you've obviously been out there both in a recruitment and a project management perspective and seeing all of this burnout. Edie, we've kept you bottled up a bit here, so please.
Oh, no, you're fine. I love hearing about
in.
it. It's just interesting to me to hear others say things that like I agree with or I would have said myself, as it is to hear people say things and me go, oh, is that your, interpretation? Or is that how it looks from the outside looking in? Or is that what you think the fix is? Just because it's interesting, right? We all have a different perspective and I welcome that. I think, I was just taking some notes over here, so this may be a little random as I was trying to sort of capture different pieces from different folks. I think the first principle that I really want to make sure, especially folks who aren't in the research industry, understand is so all research isn't actually regulated. Research is regulated based on who funds the research. And while a lot of that is the United States, in the United States, or an entity of the federal government, which gives us that leeway to then mandate an IRB approval. Or, for example, you're working on a drug study, right? So you eventually want FDA approval, which means you're going to have to follow their rules. There are some of these cases that happen outside of that. And when we look at global issues, which are just as important as our own domestic ones in research misconduct, you see a lot of issues tied to exactly that and exactly the clarity and definition of what misconduct is and what it isn't. Because I would argue even in the U.S. definition, we're only going against either a criminal activity, so a defrauding of monies, right, by the federal government outright, and or the falsification, fabrication, plagiarism. So some of these other very questionable research practices that maybe you pick up on, like Pamela was talking about, by starting to detect non-compliance, and you have to dig into a root cause, and then you find out there's a toxic lab environment, there's an absentee PI, and so on. Those aren't actually regulated by the FDA now, or by the federal government. You're going to argue, of course, well, we say someone who's trained, someone who's qualified, someone who's present, someone who's visible. We do, but that doesn't mean we do it, and we can't audit every study, right? And that's where we begin to talk about resources and auditing, because this becomes a huge part of the picture in terms of visibility, detection, and prevention. Some of your greatest, in our, in a lot of folks' opinions, is education against research misconduct, which I couldn't say enough about because I'm a huge education proponent, as everyone knows. And we have a good sense out there of new investigators or new folks who are coming into research, new staff getting educated in these spaces and understanding some of these spaces where we fall prey and where someone who isn't otherwise a bad actor ends up in a misconduct situation, because that really is the norm. The straight up bad actors are few and far between. The accidents that roll from a snowflake to an avalanche is the absolute majority, okay? So we're good at catching new folks. We're not good at catching the folks who were here 20 years ago. And there's no mechanism by which to sit them down and re-educate them. And it's where we see some of these findings in your larger academic institutions happen the most, right? And it's where we see some of these environments present that create that space. And so it comes down to a matter of accountability. If when these are detected, is the organization prepared to actually do something when you don't outright have, say, a federal regulation that says being mean to your staff or being less than present in the lab is okay or not okay, right? And that's where a lot of times actually I found specific to your research integrity folks at your organization, and I do mean just the misconduct and integrity folks, not IRB, not the rest of HRPP, that they really struggle to gain traction because even when they find a problem, it doesn't fit the exact policy definition of that FFP I keep saying. And so the organization goes, we're not really sure what we can do to this person. We're not really sure what the appropriate step is. There's not a protocol for this. It doesn't mean they don't do something about it, but it's not clear cut. And it makes accountability very difficult. And of course, you have to add to that academic environment that you're often talking about tenured faculty. And so this is a very sensitive subject because misconduct is one of the few things in their contract that can outright get them fired. And they're going to sue you after that, but it can get them fired. But questionable research practices likely do not fall into that category or oversee their tenure. And so you begin to get into some very quagmire positions of how an organization with best intentions goes about finding and enforcing all of these different pieces. The other part of it is even within our own mechanisms and organizations where you have a great IRB, a great human research protection program, and also a great research integrity and misconduct program. The research misconduct or integrity program is usually not a part of the HRPP. They're not doing a lot of talking. And so where the IRB might pick something up or require some cross-training and some facility and education so that they can more readily help detect and refer issues for consultation. And likewise, like maybe the misconduct office gets something and they say, you know what, this is IRB noncompliance. This isn't us. You need to talk to them. Well, if they're not cross-educated and talking, you have a problem there, right? Or if, for example, you have 5 campuses and 10,000 research studies, you only have one research integrity officer for all of them, as many other folks are alluding to here on the call, you're not resourced to be able to detect all this. And so it goes on and perpetuates in a way that even the organization is probably not happy about, right? And I think some of it is our inability to detect it because the statistics that the Federal Office of Research Integrity puts out year after year, while they advocate for training and they advocate for policy and they advocate, for conversations and mentorship, their hard statistics each year, year after year show that the greatest prevention is detection. All the educational efforts, all the policies in the world are not stopping it from happening, but when we're catching it and enforcing it and making individuals aware of the cost, that's when we see it drop. The final thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up and let everybody else get back to it because I know we have so many more wonderful folks, is just so you guys understand, having been in that Rio role, knowing there was a bad actor in my midst, and this is something that I would urge those of you who are at large organizations, whether that's academic or sponsor-oriented, because I see a huge, huge problem with this, is someone's a bad actor at your organization. You figure it out. You find them guilty of misconduct. You dismiss and terminate them. There's probably some pretty staunch confidentiality clauses that completely bind your hands at institution A from calling up your friends at institution B, where you now know this person is about to get a job, and say, hey, I want to tell you why we terminated them. They committed misconduct. It was bad. They're going to hurt your institution. So I can't call Sophie over at institution B and tell her about this bad actor. And if her organization doesn't do a deep enough dive into that bad actor's history and prior terminations, timing, etc., and essentially read the tea leaves, they could very potentially hire him too. So just be aware that part of it, once someone's known, unless it's a public case that makes the news, becomes very difficult to track from organization to organization and really begs the argument of be more careful with vetting who you're hiring. No one who has misconduct in their history is probably going to tell you that in a job interview. So go looking, dig deeper. And that's where I'll park this. Thanks so much. This is Edie. I'm complete.
Thanks, Edie. Thanks for tying all of that together with a beautiful thread so we could understand where we're going on this journey. That was really, really helpful. I know that Scott and Michael and Taya have multiple other things to add, but I see that Dr. Heather is back and she hasn't had a chance to speak yet, so I wanted to give her a chance to add her 2 cents here before we move on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me this time?
Yes, success.
Okay, great. Sorry, last time I was trying to talk, but I didn't realize that you weren't hearing me. So good afternoon again. I'm Dr. Heather. I am, prior to medical school, I was a clinical coordinator at a variety of different locations. I was the person who loved to travel, so I did the consulting, jumping from site to site and state to state. And so I've seen a lot of different clinical research sites. And also too, I am now trained as an MD. So I do not practice, but I am trained as an MD. And one of the things that struck me when I came back into, deciding that I did not want to practice, but I actually missed the research world, was the change in the criteria for your coordinators. I don't know how has anyone even looked at that as far as like, how we're talking about fraudulent and misconduct. And one of the things that I notice is that the criteria for coordinators and such has gone down. It's no longer required that you have a college degree or that you have, there's just certain things that we used to have back when I was doing clinical coordinating that you don't need anymore. And quite frankly, the fact that I have so much experience and stuff prevents me from getting hired, I feel like. And it was just crazy to me because it didn't make any sense. So the recruitment and the criteria have changed. The landscape of who does the recruiting has changed. How they go about doing the recruiting has changed. And I don't think it's necessarily for the better because you have a lot of people now who are, um, they're looking for things in a way that make that to me, their recruitment methods are questionable. I'll put it that way. Also, too, when we talk about decentralizing and the tech and the people trying to do research studies from home and things like that. And I totally agree with everything that's been said about that as far as trying to be able to provide oversight and stuff like that. The other thing is that something very basic that I think most people don't really understand is that your average doctor or nurse, and I can say this because I am one, are ignorant to technology. So their ability to properly use whatever system you gave them it's never quite as high as you want it to be. And if I'm frustrated and looking at your platform, whatever it may be, at 4 o'clock in the morning or 10 p.m. when I am dog tired and just ready to go to bed, you might just get whatever I felt like putting in the system, not necessarily what was really supposed to be there, but it's the best thing that I could come up with at the moment because you just you made it very clear that this report had to be done at this time, or I have to put this type of parameter in within this amount of time after, after communicating with this patient or whatever the case may be. So I totally agree with those who are saying that decentralization is a bad idea. I'm like, we can't even control or deal with centralized. How in the world are you going to deal with decentralized? I can't see that really being a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other thing that came up, or two, just last point is regarding the PIs. I'm grateful to say that I had wonderful PIs for the most part. There was one place I worked at that I would never recommend, but everywhere else I worked, I had great PIs who provided awesome oversight. I knew how to communicate with them. I knew how to reach out to them. And one of the things that comes to mind as I'm listening to you all is expand the type of training that is provided for PIs. Number one, the best PIs I had were the ones who had a real relationship with the sponsor, because the relationship with the sponsor was not just I like you, it was you critical think, and I can see that you're thinking with what we're doing, so I know more about what you're doing even when I can't talk to you. The work that you send in tells me that your site is being overseen by someone who is with us, who is really in the study with us. So I think that that's one thing is changing kind of the way that PIs are allowed to be trained, instead of just, oh, you know how to enter the information in the computer and you know this and this. Forget the monkey stuff. Any monkey can put in data, but okay, can we connect with you? If you the sponsor can't connect with them, I can guarantee you the people at their site aren't either. And then the other thing is that they need leadership and professional development training, which is what I'm doing now. And so that's the reason why I can hear this clearly in here, because the PIs don't have the PI sets the atmosphere, right? And if the PI is not setting the proper atmosphere, most of the time it's based on ignorance. They don't, they're still scientists. And, with scientists that comes, I mean, no offense to anybody, but it does come with some social issues. And we need to talk about communicating. Okay, are you really connecting with your staff? If the sponsor brought someone in to help you conduct a study, are you and this person able to collaborate together, not just work side by side? I hand you a piece of paper, no, are we collaborating? Are we really intentionally working together for the greater good? Those things matter, and also too, a lot of the reason why we're not seeing the collaboration beyond just the person's lab is because one of the main issues that I ran into, especially when I was working on like challenging studies, was the fact that you had doctors and just people in the community who were afraid of losing their patients. So they refused to allow their patients or to encourage them to participate in your study because they were feeling like, oh, well, you're going to steal my patients, or, no, trust me, we have enough work. We're not trying to steal your patients. We will send them back. But most doctors are ignorant to the truth of research because they've never done it. And so they don't understand that this is going to help your practice by encouraging your patients to participate in research. So there's a lot of ignorance there. And sorry, there's one other thing. Someone mentioned social media. If we're telling people not to get their news from social media, but to look at credible sources, why are we telling them then, yes, you should be getting something so critical as your understanding of clinical research from social media? We need to balance that out with, okay, where to get it on social media, how to get it, who is the source on social media that you're getting it from. And I think it's more important to have a forum like this where the potential patients could ask questions and be educated on the fact that we have progressed a long way from Tuskegee, but it's being talked about so much because there's nothing else to talk about. Unless you read Henrietta Lacks, you really don't know what the heck is going on in research. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Dr. Heather, thank you so much. I think from everything that you have said, the bottom line is education. Education for the clinical trial coordinators, for the PIs, for the patients, for the sponsor representatives. If we don't make sure that everyone knows what all is involved in an accurate, ethical, clean study, then how can we expect them to, do the right thing, right? First of all. And I didn't consider the idea of leadership training, but you're absolutely right. It is really, really important. And these relationships between, not just between the sponsor and the site and CRO, but also between the players at the site level or the players at the sponsor level, that is so important. But we can't just be sitting in each of our silos and do our work and expect things to move forward. We're not islands. None of us are islands. We can't move anything forward by ourselves. So until we can listen and work together with each other and drawing from each other's strengths, that's the only way we're going to prevent bad actors and falsification of data that we've seen. So I loved everything you said. Thank you so much. I see Pamela. Are you flashing because you had something to say?
Yes.
Or
I wanted to
yeah,
ask
go
Dr.
ahead.
Heather a question. I am curious about the transition because Heather was a coordinator and worked in research prior to becoming a doctor, and I was a coordinator a long time ago. The investigator meetings and trainings that we used to get from sponsor companies, I thought was fantastic for new doctors because you don't learn really about research and the regulations in medical school or residency. You learn about it. A lot of our new doctors learned about it at the investigator meetings, but sponsors have moved into like online modules. Some of it was before COVID, but I know COVID pushed some of it, but this was happening even before COVID to save money on the traditional investigator meeting and sponsor training. And I see our new investigators missing like essential, bare, basic concepts. And I'm curious from like a doctor's perspective, um, were investigator meetings helpful where they had that kind of uh, education provided on site by the sponsor, um, from, for doctors? I don't know if I phrased that well, but hopefully you understand what I mean. From a doctor's perspective, do you think an in-person educational program is beneficial?
Absolutely. I appreciate what you're saying, and I think, for one, I have not been back in clinical research since since I had my MD. I'm being very honest. No one would even interview me for clinical research. The one person who did, well, let's just say it was the shadiest experience I had ever had.
No.
Um, so, anyways, what I can say is this much. When it comes to, I think what people forget is there's more that happens than just your objectives in the midst of someone being at an in-person meeting. When I'm at an in-person meeting, I'm rubbing elbows with the other person who's also conducting the same study. So therefore, I have another person I can connect with. There is a higher, I feel like when I'm in the room with you, it's one thing. Well, first of all, it's one thing for me to be, again, siloed where I can just do my own thing my own way based on my interpretation of the information. It's a whole other story when when I have to see you in person and we have to have those discussions. Because, when you're sitting there at the investigator meeting, you have some really interesting discussions with different people who are saying, oh, well, I've done this type of study before, or this or that or the other. Did you hear about this? And it challenges you in a different way. And so I'm like, if they want to do the online, I think one of the things is to always make sure that there is an in-person mandatory component that is not, excuse me, not in person, but, a live component of the online training that requires you to engage, even though it is virtual, but requires you to engage or something of that nature. Because if you don't, then you still run into the same thing, which Sophie clearly pointed out, was the silos. Like you end up
Mhm.
with, well, our group interpreted these things this way. Because the other thing you have to remember is that the continuity is also kept by the monitor. And if the monitor is not is not up to snuff, not doing their job, then they allow, well, over at my other site, they do things this way. Well, at this site, they do things this way. And at this site, they do things that way. Because then the other piece of the puzzle is the documentation. Do you have the documentation to support it? And is someone calling you on the fact that your documentation is either lacking, weak, or non-existent? And, or is it up to snuff? Is it telling the story? Like, I should be able to read your documentation and it tell the same exact story that you're telling me out of your mouth. But if you're saying one thing and your documentation is not, you know, pairing up, then I should definitely be concerned. So I think the other part of that is making sure that the monitors and the PIs have that time together to really communicate and do something other than just talk about the study. I can tell a lot about a person just by a conversation, and of course, it's easier to do in person.
It is. I did some training, PI training, after findings of noncompliance, and we did both in person, where we hired a speaker from Barnett International and mandated the PIs to attend. And then we also did online modules because the PIs said they would prefer doing it on their own time electronically. And when I bought online modules, only one PI in the system finished all of the modules, and it was only 3 hours of work. And but coming to the in-person training, they got a lot more out of it. And that experience for me, in terms of trying to prevent misconduct and noncompliance, it's made me really frustrated that the sponsors have moved to these online modules. They are so simple and easy to do, but I think the PIs just fly through them and the knowledge is not getting absorbed. And that's leading to the non-compliance that could potentially lead to the misconduct.
This goes
Also,
back to the online, or the what is it, what the Taya was saying earlier about being overworked and
Yes.
under-resourced. Yeah, and that's probably why some of these physicians are asking about, online modules and wanting to do it on their own time. But the truth is, unless and until there's protected time for them to train to
That's key.
each of their clinical trials, there used to be, at least for academic hospitals, protected time, protected academic time, protected administrative time, and protected research time. But now we're getting more and more, expected to see us hour, and that's become more important than you know the integrity of the work. And there isn't that balance of clinical responsibility, academic responsibility, and then administrative responsibilities as well. So where do they find that time? Where do they, unless we give them that protected time where they're mandated, like
And
you said,
Right,
Pamela,
right.
to
But
be in an in-person training?
there's
And what does
also,
It
that say about the
becomes
importance of it for the organization? Like, so let me
correct.
get this straight. When your organization clears $1 billion in research funding grants this year, you're going to blast out an email to the whole state or tri-state area, and you should. That's exciting. But you gave all of these wonderful researchers that are getting you that money or that notoriety how much protected time, how much really quality training and resources, how much staff appropriately, how many studies assigned to each coordinator they're provided, and so on and so forth, to actually do all of that. And so those folks who are, I think, internal to the organization get a very different view than those who are external consumers of the organization, right? Because if you're a member of the community, you're like, this is amazing. I want to go get my care here. They seem like they've got it together. But if you're inside, you're like, we're overworked. We can't do it. We're not doing it right. We're not making time for the things that are important with quality. Da 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 da. So, Scott, I know you're going to say something too.
well, yeah, just to add on, I mean, there is a big part of this is a staffing issue, right? I mean, we have X% of the workforce has left and won't return, right? We talked about coordinators have always been overworked and underpaid, but now, if you look at the statistics, I don't think we're going to catch up with nursing staffing levels. I think they said it's going to take 2 generations to actually recover and actually have the amount of nurses we have. So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, that's not pragmatic. That's not realistic. That's not going to happen. Because I'm just thinking about the realities of the pressures. I'm also hearing a little bit from the academic medical center perspective, but I think the majority of clinical trials these days are done either at community centers, not affiliated with an academic medical center, who use a central IRB, and or there's a big push, of course, now for going to research naive sites to try to, back to kind of our diversity topic earlier, you have people looking, where do we go to find patients that look like this? Well, we need to not go to MD Anderson Cancer Center for every
Right.
study. We need to open up the community center in X city. So you're starting to have people, and
But
there's
those
even,
folks are even less resourced, would be my argument. So
Yeah.
when you're that small, lean
right,
site and you're trying to get a sponsor to pay attention to you and you're saying, hey, I've got this diverse patient population, or you're a community hospital trying to compete with the academic medical center in town, you have even less resources. And the sponsors won't pay for it. They're not going to give you
no,
that
Those people
that's
extra,
need
you
fine.
know what
more
I
education.
mean?
Yeah,
Right.
they
And they
need
need
more
more
to expect
education than
more
anyone.
education. Yeah.
Right. So you have a staffing issue, but I also fear, here's a little bit of a fear I have too. I am Mr. All gas, no brakes. So to be talking about, putting more regulation in place or oversight, my fear actually is that we have come out of COVID and shown that we can be an innovative industry. We are an industry that really didn't evolve much for like 30, 40 years, right? We put electronic data capture in place in the early 2000s, and people's heads blew up and said, you can never move that to electronic. We can't have electronic records. That was our big innovation, right? We've come out of the pandemic with some new novel ways, and we have the regulators saying, you don't have to do 100% source document verification. We never told you you had to do that. You also don't have to have a patient go to a site for everything. And so I fear, while I want controls and I want better oversight, because I do feel like one bad actor sets our industry back so far and it kills trust. But at the same time, I don't want that to kill innovation, right? I don't want us to have to patients where they are and moving studies, clinical research is hard and make some good progress. I hope that we can continue to do that with our foot on the gas while making sure there's proper oversight, while making sure we educate and not, hitting the brakes too much on innovation, because I still feel like we're so far behind. So that's a little bit of a concern I have. And when you think about whether it's the limited staffing, whether it's the nurses, whether it's 22% annual turnover in CRAs, who are the ones going out to clinical sites, or whether it's the sponsors who never actually speak with a clinical site, they go through a CRO who actually owns the relationship. It's a little broken, and I feel like it needs more effort. And I'm a little fearful that we don't have enough people really right now to help with that.
Can
Scott,
I
I
go
think,
next?
yeah, I was just going to jump in, Scott, and reinforce that the workforce scenario, which that really all of clinical trials is really a matter of labor management, and it's just I just don't think there are enough people. Just as I was remarking before, you can't be in a situation of a one-to-one oversight over everybody that's actually doing the work. So this is just a really tough conundrum that we even have to police for accurate, honest data collection. It's just very, very frustrating.
Can I close out with my
Yes,
perspective?
please, Christine. Indeed, we are near the end of our time, but this has been an amazing level of conversation here. So please, Christine, go ahead.
Yeah, I've loved listening in, and we've jumped from topic to topic, so I've got notes written all over the place, and I can't possibly get to every single one of them. But I think one of the things that I'm listening in is, we're on this fight for digital rights as patients, and to see something like that come out is always really disappointing. I think we were making a little bit of progress on clinical trials and getting different populations to understand the value of them and why you needed to participate. And this definitely puts another mark onto why they wouldn't participate. But I think we have to look at a lot of transparency. We have to look at the incentives. But on the other side of it, too, I work with a bunch of different companies who recruit patients for studies, who also find a lot of patients who lie about their own information to try to get into studies. And so when we're thinking about the information, I think it will probably come out soon, and at some point, if someone decides to pick up on that, right, that it's not just researchers, it's patients. But and always the reasons are financial in a lot of the misconduct. So I think looking at how we structure this, how the business model works, we don't want another Henrietta Lacks case, and looking at that, how do we incorporate some of these digital technologies? I'm all for decentralized trials, but I think they need to be hybrid, right? I think you have to have a combination. I don't think you're fully ever going to succeed with a fully decentralized trial. And that's just me sitting in all these conferences and listening in as a patient. But I also think, how do we incorporate digital tools and engage these patient populations so that they're not participants in a study, but actual partners in the study? And so, I don't know, just something to think about. And I'm done.
Thanks for joining, Christine. I know you've been on a whirlwind at all these meetings, and we're always appreciative of your participation and your patient's view. I think what we want to do now is try and close some things out here, perhaps go around the room and just get any last comments. But it's very clear that, and Scott had to jump off here, but basically Edie, Scott, and Sophie and I will be kibitzing about where we go next with this, because I think there's a lot that's unsaid yet. Edie, could I ask you to kick us off here, just kind of flowing through the line, and give us a few closing comments?
Yeah, absolutely. No, great discussion. And as I said earlier, always interesting to see it through each and everyone's, lens, and what's the most concerned and what do we think is the fix or the root cause. I think an interesting place to take this conversation, if we have an interest, and I know we're going to take a holiday break in January, but as we're trying to sort of close, as opposed to trying to summarize all these different threads and all these different passions that have been presented, rather looking to the future, I think it would be interesting to get folks who are more in tune, if you will, with what they're seeing in the research misconduct and integrity space. And by that I mean, so many of you may not know this, but there is an association of research integrity officers focused on research-based misconduct and questionable research practices that is in the United States. It's actually a really small organization because there's not that many of them, but they, along with their counterparts in community and freestanding research sites, often who don't have active resources for research misconduct, would have a really good finger on the pulse of like the before and after of decentralized, what we're seeing now, what some of the driving factors are beyond just broad pieces. They would probably have some great statistics they could share. So I think there's some value in thinking about, is that somewhere that we take the conversation to ground it in some of that practicality that, for example, Scott was suggesting, and frankly, I love and live by, in terms of why is this still happening? We knew it was happening before decentralized, so that's not the root cause, but now it sounds like virtual and decentralized and remote work is expanding the ability and the capacity to do it. So what is reasonable? And I'm one of those big people, as you guys know, who if I don't know the cause, I can't get to the solution. So I'd love to really dive in and have a little more information about that, and then see what this group did with that. You know what I mean? See what great ideas we have. So room for consideration, and until we meet again, happy holidays to each and every one of you. This is Edie. I'm complete.
Thanks, Edie. Sophie?
Thanks, Edie. Perfect. Yeah, I really wanted to talk about what we haven't gotten to yet as well. The subjects that we have discussed in the past 4 to 5 months: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. They're all affected by this falsification and fraud that we're talking about, because we are affecting trust on a grander scale, right? So before we can improve our systems, before we can cast a wider net and include more patients in different geographies, ethnicities, and genders and walks of life, we really have to make sure that we have a sound system, right? That we are providing a fair and accurate depiction of what we're doing with clinical trials, that we are providing all of the options to our patients honestly, and that we have people who, this is one of those industries where it really matters if you love your job. I think Taya brought that up earlier. It can be very frustrating when you work with people who are there for a paycheck, and I've seen that also. It's not like some other industries where is as long as you do complete the tasks that were assigned to you that day, everything is going to be fine, and it will move, the assembly line will move, the car will be made, and it will take off. We're talking about patients' lives. We're talking about innovative medical therapies, drugs and devices and procedures that we're supposed to be proving are at least as safe and effective as what's already on the market, right? So that requires people who actually care. That requires passionate people. So I think that's where I'd like to see this conversation go next time. And I would also love to hear from people who have some solutions, who have implemented some solutions in their local geographic area and have seen some fruitful results that maybe the rest of us could take with us to our places of work. And hopefully we can combat some of this, at least the fraud. I think the non-compliance, the accidental non-compliance is a little bit harder, but that's the root cause, right? That's where we can identify the root and prevent the fraud altogether. But at least if we can prevent this purposeful outright fraud, I think we will be getting somewhere. So I'd love to hear some solutions next time. And again, thank you all of you for joining and for providing your perspective. And like Edie said, we're coming upon the end of the year, so I want to wish everyone happy holidays and happy new year. And I've really enjoyed these discussions, especially the past 4 or 5 months. So thank you for including me, and we'll see you on the flip side. This is Sophie. I'm complete.
Sophie, we couldn't do this without you, so thank you for your kind comments. I'll go to Pamela real quick here, and then Dr. Heather to kind of get just a quick note if you want to close out anything.
No, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be part of the discussion today.
You are absolutely welcome anytime, Pamela. Dr. Heather?
Hello. I can honestly say that it has been a delightful conversation. I do not get on Clubhouse very much, but this one was definitely worth it. So thank you. And I would love to hear also too, along with the solutions and best practices, is to encourage more discussion about, what is not just what is the root cause, but how do you have those delicate conversations? Because when you're going to call somebody on something, like it's not intent, you don't have to like break them down and hurt them, but make it clear that that word that keeps popping up in a lot of the different comments, responsibility. We are, if you're going to be in clinical research, you're responsible for ensuring the integrity of the arena of clinical research. Everyone, it's not just one body or one group of people who can do it. It's everybody's responsibility, and not to make it a super, bigger, heavier job than it already is, but to say like the little bit of the space that you control, try to make sure that that space has the level of integrity that you would want someone you love to encounter if they were in a study. Thank you. I am complete. And happy holidays, everyone.
Wow.
Michael, can I read you?
Powerful, powerful comments, Dr. Heather. Thank you so much. And you are welcome here anytime. We hope you'll join us in the future. Christine?
Heather, Dr. Heather, I want to say I love the sound of your voice. It's very soothing too. When you're talking about these topics, it doesn't enrage me. You're just not that this room ever engages me or enrages me, but I wanted to leave you guys with one thought, and that is like as we think about the future and we think about patients fighting for their digital rights, that there is going to be a lot of trust involved when it comes to the giving of people's data in the future, right? And if we're looking at things like blockchain, I eventually see all of this going to like a marketplace, right? Where somebody has blockchain and they choose an agency, a CRO, or somebody that is going to use their data and give it to the studies that are needed, right? And so I think if you think about where we're going in the future, and not like 5 years here, but like 10 years from now, if these things ever happen, I think there's going to be a lot of weight in people having agency over their data. And then again, to know that it's being misused or whatever, if you have agency to pull that back, the bad players will eventually eliminate themselves. And so just something to think about as we go into the new year. And thanks for always having me.
Thank you very much, Christine. Yep, I couldn't agree with you more. Taya, any last thoughts?
Uh, yes, thank you, Michael. I think it's such a complicated issue, and there's so many things that we could dive into. One being the siloed work that we do, not understanding what others do in the industry, not understanding the whole process, but just such a small piece that can lead to non-compliance in so many ways. And the chasing of the money instead of focusing on patients. So many of the companies now are run by boards, and they're deciding things based on how much money will end up in their pocket and not on what's best for the patient. That's a huge issue. High turnover in our industry is a huge issue. Burnout leading to just this apathetic workplace is a huge issue. So, I mean, there's so many things we need to fix, and it is scary and overwhelming when you see all the places where we're broken. But hopefully, with people like us that love and care about the industry, like Sophie said, uh, we can help shape the future of things and make it better. But thank you for having me.
You are quite welcome, and happy holidays to you. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of what was brought up today does deal with advocacy for the patients who are involved so that the data is treated correctly. And it's not lost on any of you, I'm sure, that this whole clubhouse concept has been enabled by the fact that there is a company called Consuli behind this. We are a public benefit company with a mission to enable individuals to participate in that data economy and be able to make sure that their data is being treated with the dignity required for that, and that they are, from a justice standpoint, being compensated for that volunteering of that data. Consuli does this by operating a marketplace for members where the company does become we are B Corp that becomes their agent and assembles their data, whether that comes from health records or wearables or their opt-ins to any clinical trials. And the reality here is we're trying to provide a platform in which some of these issues related to misconduct, et cetera, can be minimized. So great conversation today. Very much so appreciated the free flow. And we look forward to, as I said, we'll be digesting all of this. The recording will be available for those of you who joined later and want to go back and listen to this. But I think we're making great strides here. And thank you all for participating in our one burning question for December. And lastly, on behalf of the team at Consuli, this is Michael Young, and I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful holiday season coming up. Thank you very much, and we'll be signing off now.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey, Michael.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey, Michael, really quick, and Sophie.
Yes.
I had a request, or at least just an idea, from Kartik today because he was unable to make the meeting.
Right, he wasn't able to make the call. Right.
He asked if, the replays are great, but he was wondering if, just as an idea, plant the seed for future, maybe 23, we tackle this, of doing a small summary, just a couple of bullets that for folks who didn't make it to say, these are kind of the topics, because we're all taking notes anyway. And
I used to do that. I don't know if you remember. I used to do that for mentorship.
I know. And that's what I told him. I said, well, this isn't a group who hasn't done that before. I just don't think that we've kind of taken it into that space. So I will take that idea to the group, and we will see what comes of it.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to at least pass that out.
No, I don't think
it is work.
Right? I know, right?
It is time consuming, and hence why I didn't volunteer when I came into it.
Sophie, you're too funny. You do so much already.
That's fine. And I don't think it should be any one person's responsibility by any stretch either. I think there's a way to talk about that and definitely get that worked out so that it's not overwhelming for any one person. Yeah,
let's see how we might be able to address that, okay?
Yeah, great idea.
I clearly think Kartik's idea is valid. It's not like we didn't think about it. We just have bandwidth
It's work. Yeah, exactly. And he gets that. Believe me, he gets that. So just know that I think if we can split it up in a way that's not mind-blowing for folks, that there's probably some value in trying to do it.
Good deal. All righty. Well, listen, we'll sign off because we don't have some of the resources that we normally do at this time. We're going to go with no music, and I will just wish you a very good holiday.
Excellent.
Cheers.
I can end the room at your countdown, Michael.
Okay, go for it.
3, 2, 1. Happy New Year!
Happy New Year.